The Nexus Military Academy floated serenely in the void between three-star systems, a testament to galactic cooperation and, more accurately, a monument to bureaucratic compromise. Where else but a neutral space station could you cram together the offspring of species that had been enthusiastically trying to exterminate each other for millennia? The architects, bless their optimistic hearts, had designed it as a beacon of unity. What they'd actually created was a pressure cooker with artificial gravity and really expensive cafeteria food. Here, in humanity's infinite wisdom to always show up fashionably late to galactic politics, was where the various species sent their best and brightest to learn the fine art of organized violence. The curriculum was simple. Take young beings at their physical prime, teach them 17 different ways to disable an opponent, and hope they'd use this knowledge responsibly. Spoiler alert, they wouldn't. The Academy's ranking system was beautifully straightforward, which is to say it was about as subtle as a supernova. Physical prowess equaled social standing, period. No participation trophies here, no points for effort or creativity. You could either bench press a hover tank or you couldn't, and the cafeteria seating arrangement reflected this harsh reality with mathematical precision. At the apex of this testosterone-fueled food chain sat the Draknari, 7-foot-tall reptilian nightmares, who'd apparently evolved from predators, so efficient that their planet's other species had simply given up trying. Their scales could deflect small arms fire, their reflexes made hummingbirds look sluggish, and their natural lifespan meant they could hold grudges longer than some civilizations lasted. Naturally, they excelled at the Academy's brand of competitive mayhem. The Korvani occupied the middle tier, insectoid beings whose exoskeletons could shrug off blunt force trauma and whose compound eyes made surprise attacks laughably impossible. They moved in precise formations and communicated through subsonic frequencies, which meant they could coordinate group beatings with the efficiency of a well-oiled machine. Charming dinner companions, really. Then there were the Velox, whose metabolism ran so hot they could literally outrun their own shadows. They'd perfected the art of hit-and-run tactics to the point where here 1 second, gone the next wasn't just a figure of speech, but a legitimate military doctrine. And at the bottom of this delightful hierarchy, humans. Sweet, squishy, adorably average humans. Oh, how the galaxy loved to patronize humanity. Such determination, they'd coup. Such spirit in the face of obvious genetic inadequacy. Humans couldn't breathe methane like the Korvani, couldn't regenerate limbs like the Draknari, couldn't phase through solid matter like the ethereal Fantari. What humans could do was show up, get beaten senseless, and then inexplicably show up again the next day wearing the same stupid grin. The Academy's combat instructors, a collection of scarred veterans from various species, found humans simultaneously endearing and frustrating. They were like those small dogs that bark at Great Danes, absolutely convinced they belonged in the fight despite all evidence to the contrary. Which brings us to Zephyr Korvanis, a Draknari specimen so perfect he could have been carved from obsidian by a sculptor with serious anger management issues. 8 feet of predatory elegance wrapped in midnight black scales, with golden eyes that seemed to catalog exactly how many ways he could dismember you while you were still talking. His ranking at the Academy wasn't just first place, it was first place with a comfortable margin that made second place feel like participation in a completely different sport. Zephyr had arrived at the Academy with the kind of reputation that preceded him like a herald announcing royalty. Back on Drakno's prime, he'd been the youngest cadet to ever complete the Trial of Rending, a charming cultural tradition that involved surviving in the wilderness while being hunted by actual predators. He'd not only survived but had returned wearing the Alpha Predator as a fashionable accessory. His combat record at the Academy read like a highlight reel of systematic domination. Broken training equipment, medical bay frequent visitor cards, and a trail of thoroughly humiliated opponents who'd learned to find other dining halls when Zephyr was eating. The instructors loved him because he exemplified everything the Academy stood for, superior genetics applied with mathematical precision. And then there was Maya Chen. Maya occupied that special category of cadet that made instructors quietly question their career choices. Not bad enough to wash out, not good enough to excel, just persistently, bewilderingly average. She ranked somewhere in the bottom third of her class, a position she maintained with the consistency of orbital mechanics. Her test scores were passing, her physical assessments adequate, her combat performance forgettable. What made Maya particularly puzzling was her attitude. Most cadets in her position showed signs of stress, desperation, or the kind of manic overachievement that screamed inferiority complex. Maya seemed almost relaxed. She attended classes, completed assignments, took her lumps in sparring sessions, and never complained. It was like watching someone treat Military Academy like a particularly violent vacation resort. The other cadets had long since written her off as one of those humans who'd somehow slipped through the screening process. Everyone knew the real reason humans had been admitted to the academy: politics. Some bleeding heart treaty provision about inclusive representation and diverse perspectives. The kind of diplomatic language that sounded noble in committee meetings and looked ridiculous when translated into actual combat performance. Maya's daily routine had become as predictable as stellar mechanics. She'd arrive at training sessions precisely on time, never early enough to seem eager, never late enough to draw attention. During combat drills, she'd pair with whoever needed a partner, absorb whatever punishment was dealt, and move on without drama. Her technique was textbook adequate, not sloppy enough for correction, not impressive enough for praise. The Academy's social ecosystem had naturally arranged itself around this hierarchy. Draknari cadets occupied the premium real estate, best dormitories, prime cafeteria tables, first pick of training equipment. They moved through the station like apex predators surveying their domain, which, to be fair, was exactly what they were. Humans clustered together in the academic equivalent of a support group, sharing tips on how to survive another day without ending up in the medical bay. They developed a sophisticated early warning system for when the larger species were feeling particularly aggressive, complete with hand signals and evacuation protocols. Maya existed somewhat outside this system, neither fully integrated with the human social network nor acknowledged by the upper tiers. She seemed content with this isolation, which only added to her reputation as slightly odd even by human standards. The Academy's training philosophy embraced what could charitably be called aggressive realism. Combat scenarios were designed to simulate actual battlefield conditions, which meant pain was not just expected but encouraged. Medical nanobots could repair most damage within hours, so instructors felt free to let training get authentically violent. This approach worked wonderfully for species with natural armor, regenerative capabilities, or built-in combat instincts. For humans, it was like learning to swim by being thrown into a hurricane. Some adapted, most survived, and a few discovered they had hidden reserves of pure stubbornness that passed for courage. The Academy's crown jewel was the central training complex, a massive chamber where the day's most advanced combat scenarios played out. Multiple levels, variable gravity fields, holographic obstacles, and enough sensor equipment to track a gnat's flight pattern in real time. This was where reputations were made and shattered with equal efficiency. It was also where Zephyr Korvanis held court. Every training session became an informal demonstration of Draknari's superiority, with Zephyr as the star performer. He'd arrive fashionably late, survey the assembled cadets like a general reviewing troops, and then proceed to systematically dismantle whatever opposition was brave enough to face him. His technique was poetry in motion, if poetry involved primarily breaking things. Each movement flowed into the next with predatory grace, and his tactical awareness seemed almost supernatural. He could read an opponent's intentions before they'd fully formed them, counter attacks that hadn't been thrown yet, and end fights while his opponents were still figuring out how they'd started. The other cadets had learned to treat these sessions like dinner theater, entertaining to watch, inadvisable to participate in unless you enjoyed extended visits to the medical bay. Which made it all the more surprising when Maya Chen volunteered as his next sparring partner. The training complex fell silent in that special way that occurs when everyone simultaneously realizes they are about to witness either something spectacular or something spectacularly stupid. Maya stepped into the combat circle with the same casual demeanor she brought to everything else, as if she'd just volunteered to help move furniture rather than face the Academy's apex predator. Zephyr's golden eyes fixed on her with the kind of attention a scientist might give to an unusual specimen. Here was the human who'd been quietly occupying space at the bottom of the rankings for months, suddenly stepping forward like she had something to prove. The novelty was almost refreshing. "The little human wants to play," he said, his voice carrying the kind of amused condescension that made lesser beings want to crawl under rocks. The translator rendered his words in perfect standard Galactic, but couldn't quite capture the reptilian undertones that suggested Maya might make a nice appetizer. Maya didn't respond, just settled into a basic ready stance that looked like something from a first-year combat manual. Her posture was relaxed, almost casual, as if she were waiting for public transportation rather than facing 8 feet of genetically optimized killing machine. The watching cadets positioned themselves for optimal viewing angles. This was going to be over quickly, but it might be educational. Nothing drove home the Academy's lessons about species hierarchy quite like watching a human get systematically dismantled by a Draknari. Zephyr circled her slowly, more out of ceremony than necessity. He could end this whenever he chose, and they both knew it. Maya tracked his movement with her eyes but didn't turn to face him, another sign of either tactical ignorance or misplaced confidence. "I've watched your training sessions," Zephyr continued, "because predators did enjoy their psychological games. Adequate technique, possible conditioning, zero natural advantages. Tell me, little human, what makes you think you can succeed where actual warriors have failed?" Maya finally spoke, her voice carrying none of the nervousness one might expect from someone about to be professionally humiliated. Maybe they were trying too hard. The comment drew scattered chuckles from the audience. Typical human logic. When facing impossible odds, make jokes. It was almost endearing in its futility. Zephyr's amusement curdled into something colder. He'd offered her the chance for banter, the ritual exchange that preceded combat among civilized species. Her response had been flippant, disrespectful, the kind of attitude that needed correction. He moved without warning, closing the distance between them in a blur of motion that would have impressed the Velox. His right hand shot forward in a grab that had ended dozens of previous matches, fingers spread to clamp around Maya's throat and lift her off the ground in one smooth motion. It was a signature move, really. Dramatic, efficient, and psychologically devastating. Nothing quite established dominance like hoisting your opponent into the air while they kicked uselessly and wheezed for breath. Except Maya wasn't there. Zephyr's hand closed on empty air as Maya slipped sideways with a minimal shift of weight that somehow carried her completely out of his reach. The movement was so subtle, so economical, that for a moment it looked like he'd simply miscalculated the distance. But Draknari didn't miscalculate distances. Ever. He adjusted, pivoting to track her new position, but Maya was already moving again. Not the frantic scrambling retreat he'd expected, but a controlled repositioning that kept her just outside his effective range while maintaining her own tactical options. "Interesting," Zephyr murmured, and now there was genuine attention in his voice rather than casual contempt. He feinted left and attacked right, a combination that had never failed to catch opponents off guard. Maya responded by doing absolutely nothing until the last possible second, then twisted away from his strike while simultaneously stepping inside his guard. Suddenly she was close enough to smell his predator's musk, positioned where his size and reach advantages meant nothing. Her elbow found the nerve cluster just below his ribcage with surgical precision, striking a point that even Draknari anatomy couldn't armor effectively. Pain exploded through Zephyr's torso, the kind of specific, targeted agony that spoke of detailed anatomical knowledge. He stumbled backward, more surprised than hurt, staring at the human who'd somehow found the one spot on his body that was actually vulnerable. "Lucky shot," he growled, though something cold was beginning to form in his stomach. Humans didn't know Draknari anatomy that well. Hell, most Draknari didn't know their own anatomy that well. Maya didn't gloat or press her advantage. She simply resumed her ready stance and waited, as if what had just happened was perfectly normal. The watching cadets had gone completely silent now. This wasn't following the script. Humans were supposed to be brave but ultimately outclassed, not whatever this was. Zephyr attacked again, this time with the kind of focused intensity that had earned him his reputation. No more playing, no more ceremony. This was pure Draknari combat doctrine, overwhelming force applied with predatory precision. Maya met his assault not with desperate defense but with something that looked almost like choreography. She moved around his attacks rather than through them, deflecting rather than blocking, using his own momentum against him in ways that seemed to violate several laws of physics. When his clawed hand swept toward her head, she ducked and stepped forward, her own hand striking his wrist at exactly the right angle to send him off balance. When he tried to grab her, she was somewhere else, and somehow his grab became an opportunity for her to land another precise strike. It was like watching someone fight their own reflection. Every attack Zephyr threw was answered not with equal force, but with perfect technique, as if Maya had studied his fighting style for years and developed specific counters for every possible move. The realization hit him just as Maya's palm strike connected with his solar plexus. She had studied his fighting style extensively. Zephyr doubled over, gasping for breath, while Maya stepped back and resumed her waiting stance. Around them, the training complex had become a tomb of silence broken only by the sound of the Academy's top-ranked cadet trying to remember how breathing worked. How he managed to ease. Maya tilted her head slightly, as if the question puzzled her. You always telegraph your attacks with your eyes. Always grab with your dominant hand first. Always expect your opponent to retreat instead of advance. She paused, considering. Also, you've been using the same 17-move combination sequence for the last 6 months. It's effective, but predictable once you know what to look for. The words hit harder than her strikes had. Zephyr straightened slowly, his predator's pride warring with the undeniable evidence that he'd been systematically outfought by a human who ranked in the bottom third of their class. That's impossible, he said, though even as he spoke, he knew it wasn't. Maya's movements had been too precise, too confident. This wasn't beginner's luck or human stubbornness. This was skill. High-level, professional-grade skill that had been hidden behind a facade of mediocrity. Not impossible, Maya replied. Just unexpected. She was right, of course. The galaxy had made a fundamental error in judgment, one that was about to cascade through the Academy's carefully maintained hierarchy like a virus through a computer network. Zephyr straightened to his full height, his golden eyes now holding something that might have been respect alongside the confusion. Who are you? Maya's expression didn't change, but something shifted in her posture. The casual, almost lazy demeanor fell away like a shed skin, revealing something underneath that made several watching cadets involuntarily step backward. Maya Chen, 3rd Generation Special Operations, Earth Defense Corps, she said, her voice carrying new authority. Granddaughter of Colonel Patricia Chen, who pioneered zero-gravity close combat techniques. Daughter of Major David Chen, who wrote the definitive manual on asymmetric warfare tactics. The names meant nothing to the alien cadets, but the way she spoke them made it clear they should have. This wasn't boasting or intimidation. This was identification, like a professional introducing herself to peers. I've been studying combat footage from every species represented at this academy since I was 12 years old, Maya continued. Draknari combat doctrine emphasizes overwhelming physical superiority and psychological dominance. It works beautifully against opponents who fight the way you expect them to. Zephyr felt something he hadn't experienced since childhood, genuine uncertainty. Then why hide it? Why pretend to be average? Maya's smile was small and entirely professional. Because average is useful. Average doesn't get special attention. Average doesn't make people wonder what you're really capable of. She paused. Average makes people underestimate you. The implications of this statement rippled through the watching crowd like a shockwave. If Maya was hiding her true abilities, what about the other humans? What about the entire bottom tier of the Academy's hierarchy? Besides, Maya added, I wasn't pretending to be average. I was being average. There's a difference. Zephyr's tactical mind, trained since birth to assess threats and opportunities, began working through the ramifications. If humans had been systematically concealing their true capabilities, then every strategic assessment, every tactical doctrine, every assumption about human military potential was potentially worthless. How many others, he asked. Others what? How many other humans are not what they seem? Maya's smile widened slightly. Would you like to find out? Before Zephyr could answer, the training complex's announcement system crackled to life. All cadets report to stations for emergency drill. This is not a simulation. Repeat, this is not a simulation. The cadets began moving toward their assigned positions with practiced efficiency, but the mood had changed. Conversations were quieter, glances more speculative. The Academy's carefully maintained social order had just taken a significant hit, and everyone could feel the tremors. As Maya walked past Zephyr toward her station, she paused just long enough to speak quietly. "You're not weak, Zephyr. You're just trained to fight opponents who think like you do." Then she was gone, leaving him standing in the center of the combat circle, staring after a human who had just redefined everything he thought he knew about warfare. The emergency drill turned out to be a routine readiness test, but for once, the instructors noticed something different in how the cadets performed. The humans, particularly, seemed more focused, more confident, as if some internal switch had been flipped. In the days that followed, subtle changes rippled through the Academy's ecosystem. Human cadets who had been consistently mediocre began showing flashes of competence that their instructors couldn't quite explain. Combat techniques that had been merely adequate became suddenly sophisticated. Tactical thinking that had been predictable became creative, adaptive, dangerous. It wasn't dramatic. No overnight reversals of fortune, no sudden domination of the rankings. Just a gradual shift in how humans approach their training, as if they'd collectively decided to try a little harder. The other species noticed, of course. Hard not to when your traditional punching bags started punching back with interest. Equipment that had never been damaged by human training sessions suddenly needed repairs. Medical bay visits became more evenly distributed among species. Zephyr found himself studying Maya during subsequent training sessions, trying to understand what he'd missed during all those months of dismissing her as irrelevant. The signs had been there, he realized. The way she moved, the way she watched other cadets fight, the way she absorbed punishment without complaint. Not the behavior of someone struggling to keep up, but of someone taking detailed notes. The other Draknari began approaching him with questions he couldn't answer. How had a human managed to counter their species' natural advantages? What did this mean for their own training? Were they going to have to actually worry about human opponents now? Zephyr didn't have good answers because the questions themselves revealed the fundamental flaw in their thinking. They'd assumed physical superiority translated automatically to combat superiority. They'd confused strength with skill, size with strategy. Humans, it turned out, had spent centuries perfecting the art of killing things bigger than themselves. 3 weeks after Maya's demonstration, the Academy held its quarterly combat evaluations. These were formal affairs, with instructors from each species observing and scoring their cadets' performance. Rankings were adjusted based on results, and the social hierarchy restructured accordingly. For the first time in the Academy's history, humans occupied positions in the top half of the rankings. Not all humans, of course. Some genuinely were as mediocre as they'd appeared. But enough to make it clear that humanity's previous showing had been less about inability and more about choice. Maya Chen ranked 7th overall. The shockwaves from this revelation spread far beyond the Academy's bulkheads. Fleet Command received detailed reports about the human anomaly. Diplomatic channels buzzed with requests for clarification about Earth's true military capabilities. Trade agreements were quietly reviewed by species who were suddenly wondering if they'd been negotiating from a position of strength or weakness. Earth's response to these inquiries was classically human, a polite smile and an explanation that their military had always been exactly what it appeared to be. The fact that appearances could be deceiving was, they suggested with characteristic diplomatic understatement, perhaps a lesson worth learning. The Galactic intelligence community went into overdrive trying to assess what other surprises humanity might have in store. If their military cadets had been systematically underperforming by design, what did that say about their actual armed forces? Their technology? Their strategic thinking? The answer, when it finally emerged through careful analysis and discrete observation, was both simple and terrifying. Humans had been playing by everyone else's rules while quietly developing their own. Back at the Academy, the social dynamics continued evolving. The rigid hierarchy based on assumed physical superiority gave way to something more complex, more nuanced. Respect became less about raw power and more about demonstrated competence. Conversations began happening between species that had never bothered talking before. Zephyr found himself partnering with Maya for advanced combat scenarios, ostensibly to better understand human tactics. Really, though, he was trying to understand how he'd been so thoroughly wrong about an entire species. The thing is, Maya explained during one of their training sessions, we never thought we were weak. We just knew we were different. She demonstrated by countering a standard Draknari grappling technique with a move that used Zephyr's own strength to flip him across the training mat. Your species evolved to dominate through physical superiority. Ours evolved to survive by being cleverer than things that wanted to eat us. Zephyr picked himself up, no longer surprised by finding himself on the ground, but still impressed by the efficiency with which Maya put him there. So you developed tactics, specifically for fighting larger opponents. We developed tactics for fighting everything, Maya corrected. Large opponents, small opponents, multiple opponents, opponents with natural weapons, opponents with technological advantages. Humans don't specialize in one type of combat because we can't afford to. We have to be ready for anything. It was, Zephyr realized, a fundamentally different approach to warfare. Where his species had perfected overwhelming force, humans had perfected adaptation. Where Draknari sought to dominate the battlefield, humans sought to understand it. The Academy's instructors began incorporating human combat techniques into the standard curriculum, though they were careful to frame it as alternative tactical approaches rather than admitting they'd been teaching incomplete doctrine for decades. The results were immediate and dramatic. Cadets who learned to combine their species' natural advantages with human adaptability became formidable opponents. The rigid combat styles that had dominated the Academy for generations began giving way to more fluid, creative approaches. 6 months after Maya's demonstration, the Nexus Military Academy graduated its most tactically diverse class in history. The final rankings showed humans scattered throughout the list, but more importantly, they showed every species performing better than historical averages. Competition, it turned out, made everyone stronger. Maya graduated ranked 3rd overall, behind a Draknari who had learned to incorporate stealth techniques and a Korvani who had mastered psychological warfare. Zephyr finished 2nd. His natural abilities now enhanced by tactical flexibility he'd learned from studying human approaches. At the graduation ceremony, the Academy's commandant made what would later be remembered as a historically significant speech about the dangers of assumptions and the value of diverse perspectives. What he didn't mention, because the implications were still being calculated by various military commands, was how thoroughly this graduating class was going to change galactic warfare. The galaxy had spent centuries developing military doctrine based on each species' natural advantages. Humans had just demonstrated that natural advantages could be countered, adapted to, and ultimately overcome through superior technique and tactical thinking. It was a lesson that would reshape everything, from individual combat training to grand strategic planning. The age of assuming that bigger and stronger automatically meant better was ending, replaced by a new understanding that intelligence, creativity, and adaptability might be the ultimate military advantages. As Maya walked across the graduation stage to receive her commission, she caught sight of Zephyr in the audience. He nodded once, a gesture of respect between warriors. She returned it with the same small, professional smile she'd worn during their first encounter. Later, military historians would mark this graduation as the beginning of what they called the Tactical Renaissance, a period when combat doctrine across the galaxy underwent rapid evolution. But that was in the future, and the participants were focused on more immediate concerns like duty assignments and celebration dinners. Maya received orders to Earth Special Operations Command, specifically to a unit tasked with training interspecies combat teams. Zephyr was assigned to the Draknari Elite Guard, but with a posting that would involve significant interaction with human military advisors. The galaxy was learning, slowly and sometimes painfully, that strength came in many forms. Physical prowess remained valuable, but it was no longer the only currency that mattered. Intelligence, adaptability, and the ability to learn from others were becoming recognized as equally important military assets. As the newly graduated officers dispersed to their assignments, carrying with them the lessons they'd learned about assumptions and underestimation, a subtle shift began working its way through galactic military thinking. Questions that had never been asked were suddenly demanding answers. Tactics that had never been considered were being tested in simulation and training. The strongest cadet in class had grabbed what he thought was easy prey, and in return had learned that there was no such thing. Maya Chen had counted not just as attack, but an entire way of thinking about warfare and strength. The galaxy would never be quite the same. And somewhere in the depths of space, humanity's military planners allowed themselves a small, satisfied smile as they watched other species finally begin to understand what humans had always known. The most dangerous opponent is the one you underestimate. After all, they'd only been trying to blend in.